It's August of 1877. For 9 whole weeks, the Nez Perce, a Native American tribe led by Chief Joseph, had been leading a series of tactical retreats from the U.S. Army after they were going to be forced at gunpoint onto the Nez Perce reservation. The American press had portrayed Chief Joseph as a military genius. He'd been holding off the U.S. military with a few hundred warriors while also protecting a much larger number of women and children with thousands of livestock. A band that large was tough to keep together, much less defend and scout for. Chief Joseph was on his way to the Crow Reservation to petition the Crow for help. His people had been on the run and dodging gunfire for 2 months. The U.S. Army under General Howard, chasing the Nez Perce since their defeat outside the reservation, had been immobilized in the most recent attack at the Battle of Camas Creek. Chief Joseph was moving forward into Yellowstone National Park, where many parties of civilians were touring the park. General William Tecumseh Sherman was tasked to stop the Nez Perce. Sherman was a famous and well-known general of his time. During the Civil War, he fought for the Union and conducted a campaign of total war on the South, hacking and burning his way from the Union to the sea, razing entire cities and towns in his wake, the city of Atlanta included. Sherman was a general to be feared. After General Grant won the Civil War and became President of the United States, he made General Sherman the commanding general of the U.S. Army. Sherman's time as commanding general was devoted to securing western U.S. states for settlement. Much of the Indian Wars of the late 19th century were fought by soldiers under his command, including the wars against the Sioux tribes and Sitting Bull. Unfortunately for Chief Joseph, Sherman was actually in Yellowstone 2 days prior to the Nez Perce arrival. He evacuated his soldiers and distributed them at all exits of the park. There was no way the Nez Perce would get out without running into his soldiers first. Each group of civilians in the park presented a new challenge. The Nez Perce would scout tourists out, surround and capture them, then allowed them to leave peacefully under the condition that they leave behind their supplies and horses. This wasn't without conflict, however. At least 2 tourists were killed and a dozen were wounded in confrontations in the park. Chief Joseph accurately suspected that the U.S. military would be waiting at all the usual exits, so he made the bold decision to exit the park through an unknown and perilous journey through the Absaroka Mountains at the northeast part of the park. It rose to nearly 10,000 feet and crossed canyons and divides that most horseback U.S. soldiers would only be able to traverse with extreme wilderness training. To the Nez Perce, it was difficult, but not impossible. Howard had tracked the Nez Perce into the northeast corner of the park, but followed no further. They left through a northern exit and met up with Colonel Sturgis's forces, who awaited the Nez Perce outside the park. Chief Joseph's scouts captured and killed all white farmers, hunters, and prospectors they ran into so as to not give away the position of their band. Leaving the mountains into the plains, however, the Nez Perce would be exposed. Their scouts confirmed the location of Sturgis's soldiers and set up a diversion. They marched their livestock in a direction the soldiers could see, while also leading them into a gulch where they could retreat and head north. Sturgis took the bait and told his scouts and soldiers to move south in an effort to intercept the Nez Perce, but lost them. Afterward, the Nez Perce were free to move across the open plains at a 2-day march ahead of Sturgis's forces. When the Nez Perce finally reached the Crow Reservation, the refugees made their case for the Crow to offer them protection. The Crow, believing that aiding the Nez Perce would bring a negative reaction from the U.S. government, denied the Nez Perce refuge. Where would they go now? Chief Joseph wasn't the only famous Native American chief of his time. As the Nez Perce were getting chased across the Rocky Mountains, the Great Sioux War was coming to a close several hundred miles away in South Dakota. Sitting Bull, the leader of the Lakota tribes who had surrendered their reservation to the U.S., was sitting in exile in Canada, 250 miles to the north. Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce then realized they had one last hope for salvation. A break for the border to the north was the only way the U.S. Army could no longer chase them. Unfortunately for the Nez Perce, many of the Crow tribes saw opportunity in Chief Joseph's peril. Many went to the U.S. Army and gave away both the Nez Perce position and their plan. Sturgis, seizing the moment, double-timed it to the Nez Perce position and attacked it at the Battle of Canyon Creek. The Nez Perce were taken by surprise as they didn't expect Sturgis to be so close behind. A firefight erupted between the soldiers and the Nez Perce. It's said that it's possible the soldiers were afraid of the Nez Perce's successes in battle because their cavalry refused to charge. Chief Joseph's warriors held off the U.S. Army by taking the high ground as their women, children, and livestock retreated to the north. Sturgis and the soldiers under him were shamed by the U.S. military for their lack of action in the engagement. To add insult to injury, many of the Crow scouts ransacked U.S. supplies and retreated into their reservation overnight. Sturgis had exhausted his horses by this time. General Howard had sent word to the nearby Fort Keogh that the Nez Perce were running for the border. Colonel Miles marched out with fresh horses and men to the northwest in hopes of intercepting them. General Sherman and the U.S. Army knew that every Nez Perce retreat was a victory, and an alliance between Sitting Bull and the Nez Perce was sure to humiliate the U.S. Army, empower the native tribes in U.S. territory, and risk a real possibility of guerrilla attacks from Canadian territory. Chief Joseph, Chief Looking Glass, Ollicott, and the Nez Perce were all but spiritually broken. The Crow tribes' betrayal had laid heavily on them, and they were getting tired. Ahead laid one last difficult geographical obstacle, the Missouri Breaks. This region of the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, is flanked by steeply eroded badlands on either side. The one place the Nez Perce will have to cross the river is the Cow Creek, an entry into the breaks where both animals and man can reach the Missouri River. The location was also a common stop for freighters to drop off supplies. An armed garrison of a couple dozen soldiers were stationed at the Cow Island Landing when they saw the Nez Perce exodus. Intentions at first were peaceful, but gunfire erupted between the two groups. The Nez Perce escaped, but not without stealing some of the supplies at the landing. Moving north from the landing, they reached a wagon train that was carrying 35 tons of freight and cattle. The train was surrounded by Nez Perce, who approached them unthreateningly and camped nearby. They ended up trading for ammunition and supplies before a small relief force was sent from the breaks to scout them out. The Nez Perce panicked, attacking the soldiers and wagon train alike. The Nez Perce ended up fighting them off and stealing more supplies before retreating ever northward. The soldiers returned to the breaks and intercepted a steamer who turned downstream to warn Miles, who was advancing from the southeast. Miles knew he had little time left before the Nez Perce would reach Canada. At this point, the Nez Perce were conflicted. Many of them demanded a rest, while others wanted to continue until they reached the border. Chief Joseph's people were tired. The first battle of the Nez Perce War took place on June 17th. It was now September 24th, the second day of autumn, and the nights were getting deathly cold. After a crisis of leadership amongst the chieftains, a council was called. They decided they would travel slower to help their more travel-weary people get a well-needed rest. They kept an eye to the south for General Howard, but they were unaware that Colonel Miles was bearing in from the southeast. After 4 days of slow travel, a blizzard left several inches of snow on the open prairie as Miles made contact with the Nez Perce. He attempted to attack quickly to confuse and scatter the Nez Perce, but Chief Joseph's scouts had already spotted Miles and warned the warriors to prepare. Fighting hunger, frostbite, and gunfire, the battle and siege lasted for 6 days. General Howard had even caught up to the battle and added to Miles's numbers. Miles said, "The fight was the most fierce of any Indian engagement I have ever been in. The whole Nez Perce movement is unequaled in the history of Indian warfare." By the end, Chief Joseph was approached by the military in parley and surrendered. The battle was bloody. Civilian Nez Perce lay dead and scattered, and some made a break for the north in the confusion. Looking Glass and Ollicott were dead. In all, the U.S. lost 24 soldiers with 51 wounded, while the Nez Perce lost 25 souls. In all, 477 Nez Perce were captured. In the famous speech by Chief Joseph, he ended, "I am tired, my heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever."